Welcome to Grieving Insomniacs. I am your host, Christy Haberman. I am glad you're here. Thanks for being a part of our community. A few disclaimers before we get started. I am a licensed therapist. However, this podcast is not to be considered mental health therapy or counseling. It is for entertainment purposes only and is not associated with my counseling practice, Christy Haberman Counseling Services. Thanks for showing up. Welcome to Grieving Insomniacs, episode 19. I'm glad you're here. It's hard to believe that this is the 19th episode of Grieving Insomniacs. I am so appreciative of everyone that's been listening to my podcast. I'm now up to 303 listens. I just don't even know that was possible when I started this out. I just know that I had something to say that I wanted to share, and I wanted to help other women like myself start to feel a little bit better after the loss of their children. So I had asked a question on Instagram about what people would like to hear from Grieving Insomniacs. Like, what part of grief did they want to talk about? And so I had a couple of interesting answers. And one of the answers was they wanted to talk about healing from grief. And so I was having a discussion with my husband before this podcast about what I was going to talk about today. And he was suggesting, well, how about all of the people that didn't show up for you that said they would? And I thought that was interesting perspective from him anyway, because I didn't realize that he had that same experience as I did, as that he thought that the important people in his life would show up for him, and they did not. So I hope at one point to have him come on and talk about what it was like to experience the death of a child from a man's perspective. So I know us women, we go about it a little bit differently than men do because, of course, we're women. And men have their own trials and tribulations when it comes to experiencing the death of a child. So let's talk about healing. And I did some Google searching because I was trying to conceptualize, even for myself, what does healing look like? If I were to say that I was healed from the death of my son, how would I know that? How would I know that I was healed? And the answer is he'd be here with me, because my family would be intact again. So that's not possible, because he's dead. And so does that mean I'll never heal? That's a very good question. And I've also had the experience of, since I am a professional counselor and have worked with many people over the years, people get kind of sensitive when they talk about healing from grief, because they associate the pain of the loss with their loved ones. So if they don't have the pain of losing that person, they feel like they will forget them. And so they hang on to the pain, which is not a bad thing. But when you talk to someone about healing from their grief, you need to understand that is that their pain is the equivalent of their memories of the lost loved one. And so they're intertwined in there together. And so when you ask someone to give that up, and I believe this is a mistake that many therapists make, is when they ask their clients to give up something, there's some real resistance to that. They're like, but wait, I loved this person so much. Not even necessarily talking about losing a child. It could be loss of a husband, loss of, sometimes it's pets, sometimes it's friends. but I love this person so much that you're asking me to not miss them anymore. And I think that's the piece that non-grievers miss, is that every memory I have of my son, there is an element of grief in there. There is an element of pain. Because I can't think about him without being in pain. And I just don't think people understand this piece of it. Said, yes, I have happy memories with my son. I have happy memories with him growing up. But now there's this overlay of pain in there. And they've kind of been intertwined together. So asking me to not feel pain when I think of my son is not possible. So there's one aspect. So the other thing is I had to use a little Google when I was looking this up. So I found this definition and I kind of liked it. So healing is defined as developing a sense of personal wholeness that involves physical, mental, emotional, social, and spiritual aspects of the human experience. So I like that. So it incorporates everything. And the loss of a child especially involves the physical. We've already talked about that. The mental and the emotional. I've talked about that. The social, I have not talked about the spiritual aspects yet of the human experience, but it involves all of that. And the dictionary says healing is the act or process of restoring health. The only way that I am going to be restored, and I don't even know if I can be restored back to the person that I was before my son died. Because even if something happened and he was placed on earth today, I would still have 11 years of experiences that I had without him that are still very painful. And pain changes you. It changes you in deep and dramatic ways. So maybe when it comes to grief, we need to look at it in a different way. And I see this slowly changing when I was on Facebook. I was never really an Instagram person until the last few years, but when my son first died, there were not very many support groups out there, and they were most definitely not women out there talking about their experiences of losing a child. It just didn't exist. And so as I see this cultural change evolving, I'm very happy about that. Because we're moving towards this acceptance that the loss of our children was real, that it impacts us every day, and that we don't have to go around pretending like everything is okay and fine again. So maybe we need to find another word for what it's like when the loss of your loved one or your child has been incorporated into your life. And what do I mean by that? So what I mean by that is that you can accept all the changes that have been made since your child or your loved one has died. And I'm talking about all of them. I'm talking about your physical, your mental, your social. If you just learn to live in the moment to moment, maybe that's what we're striving for. And I hesitate to call it healing because that implies somehow I'm broke. And I don't believe I'm broke. Or that somehow I'm less than, or I need to be restored to some former version of someone, and let's be frank about this, that people liked better than they like me now. The people from my past have not made it forward. And the people that know me now don't know what I was before. There's no going back to who I was before. That doesn't mean I'm broken. So how do we move ourselves to a place where we can exist in the world and not have, I don't even know what to call it. Because I absolutely think that the rest of my life is going to be filled with crying jags, with feeling sad, with having tough anniversary dates, with irritability, and yes, sometimes aggression around anniversary dates. But those are the consequences of what has happened. And I am no more in control of those consequences than anyone else. And maybe that's the struggle. The people around us that said you need to get over this, you need to heal from this, maybe those people around us, it's their inability to accept that those are the consequences of losing someone you love. And even if I had lost my spouse, I still think that I would cry and be upset on his birthday and the anniversary dates and mourn some of the memories that I would have with him. I believe that it would be the same. And then I'd have the crying jacks, and I'd be around the anniversary dates aggressive and irritable, because that's how I am. So I think there needs to be a certain amount of acceptance of that. And so I've said this before in many of my podcast episodes, and I'll say it again, is that the core to this, that I 100% believe, is that we have to accept ourselves for who we are right in this moment in time. So this moment in time for me, I'm sitting here talking to you about healing. My voice gets quavery when we talk about the loss of my son. I accept that. I accept that, maybe there'll be 1,000 people someday. Maybe there'll be an episode where I will out and out cry. But I accept that, because that is part of my grief. And that's what I think we need to do, is that in order for other people to accept us, we have to accept ourselves. We have to accept where we are right now and this moment in time. The other thing that I think is critically important is every one of you that have lost a child unexpectedly, and all child loss is unexpected. I don't care if they had a long-term illness. I don't care if they had a car accident. All of those were unexpected. Like, you didn't have a child, find out you were pregnant, and then go, oh, they're going to die someday. So every one of you is absolutely traumatized. Now, the trauma we can heal. And I have experienced that myself. I learned how to do EMDR. That is rapid eye movement desensitization. It was extremely, extremely helpful. I did one session on my grief. There was a couple of other issues that I had to resolve before I did my grief. Everybody has their issues. They're not important. But I had finally convinced the therapist to do the EMDR on the moment that I found out my son died. So my brain was stuck right there. It could not move past that. And so what happens is the very base of your skull is your amygdala. When you are traumatized, your amygdala is frozen in time. And so you're like stuck there. And you're on hyper alert, looking for the next element of danger. Until you unfreeze your amygdala, you're going to be experiencing the death of your child or your loved one over and over and over again. Because your brain is, and the brain will heal itself. You just have to give it the modality upon which to heal itself. And after I did the EMDR on that moment, and so for those of you that might be mental health professionals out there that are listening to this, you need to understand that you are not doing EMDR on the grief. You're doing EMDR on the moment that they found out. It's the trauma response that you're doing the EMDR on. And people tend to get all scared and, oh, yeah, I can't help you with your grief. Well, yes, you can. You can help them in that particular moment. And there might be other moments. For example, for me, I never used to be claustrophobic. I am now claustrophobic. Have to go have a CAT scan or an MRI. And I cannot open my eyes in that thing because I think I'm in a casket. And then it brings up all the fears and everything that I have associated with Christopher, is that somehow he's buried in the ground and he's still alive. Irrational? You bet. 100% irrational. But that's where my mind goes. Because if you never had to put your child in the ground, you will not know the level of fear that you have about what that could be like an experience. So the first thing is, and I noticed after I did my EMDR almost immediately, is that my brain had the ability to think through other options. So when I get down that runaway train, where I have a thought that I'm somehow blaming myself for the death of my child, I'm more able to bring my brain back and bring it back into rational thinking than to go down that train into my trauma response. And my go-to for my trauma is 100% guilt of self, 100%. And if I would let my brain go there, that's where I would go. And doing the EMDR helped tremendously. And there's a real fear when I talk to grieving mothers about this, that by doing the EMDR, that they will somehow forget their child, lose their grief. It's not possible. I'm telling you, it's not possible. You will never lose that love that you have for them. There's just no way. So in a way, that can be very healing. Do some yoga. Trauma stored in the body. Yoga will help move that on out. So the second biggest thing, at least for me, and I don't know how it was for other people, but for me, I could not tolerate the idea that I did not know where my son was. For him to just disappear, even if it was into some place that Christians call heaven. I'm not a Christian, so that's not a concept to me that's particularly healing or in my vocabulary. That's just not okay with me. And so the fact that he didn't exist anymore to me was intolerable. I just couldn't accept that. Like, even now when I say something like that, my brain's just like, no, that's not true. And I remember as a kid when I was first introduced to the idea of original sin through the church. I must have been 6 or 7. I knew as clear as day that that was not true. And that's how I feel about Christopher being in this abstract place. That's not true. He's not there. So for me, and I don't know how many of other, I had to create a continuing bond with him. And that was especially true in the very beginning. And I would talk to him all of the time. And I would look for signs for him everywhere. Everywhere I would look for signs of him. I'd have rituals for the anniversary dates. I had rituals for Christmas. He was never far from my mind. But for me, that was the healing part. That's the part that I had to have. And so I meditate. I saw a dragonfly just this weekend when me and my husband were working outside. I was like, hello, Christopher, how are you? When I hear certain music on the radio. And I don't care if anybody else doesn't believe me. Like, it's not up to me to convince Tom, Dick, or Harry over there that it's possible for my son to communicate with me through music. It only matters that I believe. So it doesn't matter what belief system that you create that allows you to have a continuing bond or continuing connection with your loved one. But I do think that that is a major part of being able to exist in this world while we wait to join our others in the next world. Is that we have to be able to have that sense of connection. And there are some times that I feel like I'm somehow more connected than I was when he was in Louisiana living his life and I was up here living my life. I just feel him around me all the time. Now, I'm going to do a whole podcast on mediumship. I have gone to mediums to connect with Christopher. I have had both good experiences and bad experiences. But I'm going to talk about the bad experience real quick because there's a point I want to make about this. So I had gone to a medium, someone I just heard about, saw on Instagram. First mistake. So that was the first mistake. And I wanted to make a connection with Christopher. And so she said to me that Christopher in heaven had told her that I needed not to call on him so much. Man, I was angry. I just looked at her and I'm like, what? What did you just say to me? And so I got off that call and I cried. So I tried that. And it jacked me up for quite a while. And what do I mean by jacked up? I got more depressed. I got more anxious. And man, did I get angry. Oof. I was angry. And I just couldn't understand that this continuing bond, which is what had helped me cope for and this was just last fall, so 10 years, that had helped me cope for 10 years, someone was trying to take away from me. And in that respect, And I haven't gone back to a medium. Well, that's not true. I have gone back to a medium sense. But I'll never go back to that person. But I do know. And I was upset for a while. And I was driving on my way to work. And I said to myself, I said to Christopher, I said, look, you don't have to come to me every time I think about you. If I think about you and I need you, I will say, Christopher, I need your help. And then you can come to me. And I told him, I said, but I have to be able to believe that you're sending me signs, that there's music, that you're playing the music for me, that we can go through prayers. I said, I have to have that. For my ability to move forward in my life, I have to have that. So that's why I wanted to discuss that here, which is, for me personally, that is one of my major coping mechanisms for the grief of my son, was realizing that. So I can't sleep. Of course, grieving insomniacs, we know that's why this podcast is called Grieving Insomniacs. One night, shortly after I had this conversation with Christopher, I was trying to sleep at 3 a.m. And I just had this thought. And I was kind of agonizing over, how could Christopher say such things about me? How could he be like, Mom, I don't want you to call on me? Like, it just didn't match who I knew my son to be. It just didn't. And so I was just laying there, and then I heard this thought in my head, but you believed her. You thought so little of me that you believed her. And I realized that she was wrong. When I had that thought, I was like, wow. So he's a little upset too, because I believed her and it wasn't necessarily true. And I just accept those things as fact. I know it sounds crazy when I'm talking about how I still have these conversations with him, but they are the major part of what helps me cope on this journey. And I think he sits here on this podcast and listens and, gives me feedback and gives me insights. And, it's the two of us doing this together. And that's fine. I'm okay with that. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is acceptance of self. But we also have to accept that we were powerless over the loss of our child or over death. And I think that is where many parents, especially, I'm speaking just to the parents now, that struggle because their child died. Because we have this false belief that we should have done something, could have done something, or could have changed it in some way by changing our own behavior. And we have to accept that we couldn't. And in a society that we live in that values control, that is not an easy thing to accept. But you have to move yourself towards acceptance. Acceptance that you did everything you could, which takes us back to what I said in the beginning, which is that radical self-acceptance. You have to accept yourself for who you are at this moment in time. And you have to accept yourself as a grieving mother, because that's what you are. That's what your identity is now. And that's okay. There's not a thing wrong with that. But that's where we are. So if you take all of those things together, I think you'll come out on the other side, and I'm not going to use the word healed. I think you're going to come out on the other side, and you will at least feel like you can function in a semi-functional way with your grief. That it won't override every waking moment and every waking thought. But I promise you, you will never forget your child. You will never forget to grieve. It is just going to become a part of you and become a part of your life and become a part of who you are. And that's where the radical self-acceptance comes in. You have to accept who you are. And who we are is grieving mothers. And we are out there in this world on Instagram and everywhere else saying, this is who I am, and I am showing up. And I am showing up for you, and I am showing up for everybody around you. You accept all of that. You create the continuing bonds with your in whatever way that works for you. For some people, I know some people that have lost a child that for them, seeing that child in heaven with God or Jesus or whoever they pray to, that's very healing for them. That's their coping mechanism. But it's important to have one. And if you're one of those people that has to accept that they're gone, that's okay too. And then the last point that I cannot emphasize enough is that we have to accept that we were powerless in the loss of our child. That there's nothing we could have, would have, or should have done that would have made any difference in this whatsoever. That our children still would have died. And that's the hardest thing. That's the absolute hardest thing. Because for the longest time, I believed that if I had been in Louisiana and I had been the one in the room with him, I would have seen him die. But my dog recently died, and I didn't know he died at the moment. But then the doctor had a stethoscope and was like, could hear his heartbeat. But it didn't take long before you could tell that his body was lifeless. So I still have some anger and resentment about that. But for the longest time, I believed that I could have saved Christopher if I'd have been in the room. But that just put more guilt on me and did not help in me moving forward in this healing journey at all. And so I've come to accept that if I look at it through Christopher's eyes, Christopher would say that he would have done anything to protect his mom. This I do know about my son. And so he would have known that I would not have handled that well. So by his choice, he would have preferred to die the way he did. Not the way that I wanted it. So, and I also have to think about that in the terms of him having cancer, which was, I would want him to live, but I did not think about all the suffering he would have to go through in order to do that. And how selfish of me, right? To want him to have to suffer so I don't have to suffer. Because as a parent, we sacrifice for what's best for our children. And honestly, he had stage 3B Hodgkin's lymphoma. The road back would have been horrendous for him. So when I think about what's best for him, maybe that was what's best. I don't want to accept that. But if you believe in divine intervention or the universe like I do, then you know that with this time to go, it's time to go, and there's nothing I could have said or done about it. And that's just a tough place to be. Because I'm one of those people that value control, and because I come from my own trauma background. So that's in a nutshell, talking about healing. Please like and subscribe. It really helps me out. Leave me a message on Grieving Insomniacs. Let me know what you think of my podcast. Let me know what you think I can improve in, what you want to hear about. For those of you, and I'll have 19 unique users. For those of you that are listening, I just so appreciate you. I thank you. I look forward to talking to you next week, and have a great week.